Mom is sick, so I came instead. Who are you? Richard Cole startled. And why are you standing in front of me saying your mother is sick and you've come to take her place? The little girl straightened a little, gripping the strap of a small purple backpack. My name is Annie, she said quietly. Annie Brooks. And my mom, Danielle Brooks, she's the one who was supposed to meet you here tonight. For several seconds, the elegant dining room of Romano's Italian restaurant became strangely silent. Richard Cole stood frozen beside his table near the window. But a girl announcing she had arrived to replace her mother on a dinner date was not a situation any business school had prepared him for. He stared at her. Annie stood there calmly, small but determined. Her hair was neatly braided, tied with two small blue ribbons. A few diners had turned completely in their chairs. Someone near the bar lowered a wine glass slowly, clearly trying to hear every word. The restaurant manager hurried over, his expression tightening when he saw a child standing in the middle of his dining room. Sir, I apologize, the manager said quickly to Richard. We didn't realize a child had come inside. We'll take care of this immediately. He turned to Annie. Sweetheart, you can't be in here alone. Where are your parents? Annie shook her head slightly. My mom's at home, she answered. The manager frowned. Then how did you get here? Before Annie could answer, a man at the next table leaned toward his companion and whispered, probably a rideshare drop-off. Another voice murmured, or she wandered in, but Annie spoke clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. I rode my bike. The manager blinked. You what? I rode my bike here, Annie repeated. Several diners exchanged surprised looks. Richard felt his eyebrows lift slightly. You rode a bicycle here? He asked. Yes, sir. How far? Annie thought for a moment. About 6 blocks. A quiet murmur spread through the room. 6 blocks. At night. For a 6-year-old. Richard folded his arms slowly. And you came here because your mother told you about this dinner? He asked. Yes. Annie nodded with certainty. She said your name is Richard Cole. She said you're tall and have light hair and you might be wearing a blue suit. Richard glanced down briefly. Blue suit. Exactly as she had described. She said the restaurant is called Romano's, Annie continued, and that you might be sitting near the window. She pointed directly at Richard's table. Now there was no more whispering. The room had gone fully quiet. The manager looked increasingly uncomfortable. Mr. Cole, he said softly. This seems like some misunderstanding. I'll have someone take the child outside and call her parents. No, Annie said quickly. Her voice was still small, but the determination in it was unmistakable. I need to explain. Richard raised a hand slightly. The manager stopped talking immediately. Years of power had given Richard a particular kind of authority, one that didn't require raising his voice. Richard looked back down at Annie. Tell me what happened, he said. Annie clasped her hands in front of her backpack. My mom worked late today, she began. She works at the hospital. Richard listened carefully. When she left work, it started raining really hard, Annie said. She walked home anyway. A few people nodded quietly. Anyone who lived in Chicago understood sudden spring storms. When she got home, Annie continued, she started shaking and coughing. Her voice softened. She had a fever. Richard felt something shift slightly inside his chest. She tried to get ready for the date anyway, Annie said. But she couldn't stand up. The manager's irritation slowly faded into curiosity. My mom kept saying something, Annie added. Richard leaned forward slightly. What did she say? She said she didn't want you to think she didn't care. The sentence landed gently in the quiet room. Annie continued. She practiced what she was going to say to you this morning. Richard blinked. She stood in front of the mirror and said, Hi, I'm Danielle. A few diners smiled faintly. It was an image everyone could picture. A woman preparing for a first date, trying to get the introduction just right. She told me your name, Annie said, and where the restaurant was, and what time the dinner started. The manager crossed his arms, clearly puzzled. So you decided to ride a bicycle across the neighborhood to deliver a message? He asked. Annie nodded. Yes. Why? The girl hesitated. Her eyes moved briefly across the restaurant before returning to Richard. Because promises matter, she said simply. Richard felt that strange tightening in his chest again. Most adults in his professional world treated promises like temporary suggestions. Contracts were broken. Deals collapsed. Partnerships ended. But this child had ridden a bicycle through the city just to explain why her mother couldn't make a dinner appointment. Annie shifted her weight slightly. Then she asked a question that made Richard pause. Are you mad? Her voice was barely louder than the music. "I didn't want you to think Mom broke her promise." Richard studied her for several seconds. The small backpack, the careful posture, the determination of someone very young trying to behave like an adult. He slowly removed his coat. Several diners leaned forward. Sensing something unexpected was about to happen, Richard stepped closer and gently placed the coat around Annie's shoulders. It was far too big for her. The sleeves hung almost to her fingertips, but she smiled faintly. Phones quietly appeared across the restaurant as people began recording. Richard ignored them. He crouched down until he was eye level with Annie. "Annie," he said calmly. "Yes, sir. Is your bicycle outside?" She nodded. "Locked to the bike rack." Richard smiled slightly. "Good." Then he asked the question no one in the restaurant expected to hear. "Can you show me where your mother lives?" For the third time that evening, the room fell completely silent, because the billionaire who had walked into Romano's expecting a quiet dinner had just made a decision that none of the guests could quite believe. He was leaving his table and following a girl who had ridden a bicycle across the neighborhood just to keep her mother's word. Richard Cole stood outside Romano's Italian restaurant beside the small bicycle locked to the rack near the curb. He felt a strange uncertainty settle over him. The evening air in Chicago carried the faint chill of early spring. Traffic lights reflected off the damp pavement, and the steady rhythm of passing cars blended with the distant hum of the city. Annie stood beside him, patiently waiting. Her bicycle was small and bright red, with a worn silver bell on the handlebar and a basket attached to the front. Inside the basket sat a small helmet decorated with faded cartoon stickers. Richard glanced back once toward the restaurant windows. Inside, he could see silhouettes of people still watching. Phones had appeared. Conversations had begun. By morning, someone would almost certainly post the story online. "Billionaire leaves restaurant with child." The headlines practically wrote themselves. But strangely, Richard didn't feel worried about that. Instead, he found himself looking down at Annie. "You really rode 6 blocks by yourself?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Annie answered. Her voice was calm, almost matter-of-fact. Richard rested his hands in the pockets of his coat. "And you knew exactly where this restaurant was?" "My mom showed me on the map last night," Annie said. "She wanted to make sure she didn't get lost." Richard nodded slowly. He had assumed Danielle Brooks simply changed her mind about the date. People did that all the time, especially when they realized who he was. But the picture Annie painted was different. A woman who had prepared carefully, who had memorized directions, who had practiced introductions in the mirror. Someone who had actually wanted to come. Richard exhaled quietly. "Well," he said, glancing toward Annie's bicycle again. "We probably shouldn't ride that all the way back tonight." Annie looked up. "Oh," she said, suddenly remembering something. Then she added politely, "I forgot to tell you, sir. I just turned 6. Richard blinked, surprised by the detail. "6? Yes, sir. I turned 6 in January." Richard studied her again with new awareness. 6 years old, and she had ridden a bicycle across the neighborhood alone just to deliver a message for her mother. Richard smiled faintly. "Well, Annie, 6-year-olds probably shouldn't be biking across the city at night." Annie nodded thoughtfully. "My mom says that too." Richard chuckled softly. "Don't worry. We'll take my car." He unlocked the sleek black Mercedes parked along the curb. To Annie, the vehicle looked enormous. She stared at it with open curiosity but didn't say anything. Richard opened the passenger door. "Go ahead." Annie hesitated. "My bike? We'll put it in the trunk." He lifted the small bicycle easily and placed it carefully inside. Once Annie climbed into the passenger seat, she folded her hands in her lap like a student trying to behave perfectly in class. Richard walked around the car and sat behind the wheel. For a moment he simply looked straight ahead. This was not how his evening had been planned. At 7 o'clock he had expected polite conversation, possibly an awkward dinner, then a quiet ride home. Instead, he was now driving across the city with a 6-year-old girl who had just replaced her mother on a blind date. Life had a strange sense of humor. Richard started the engine. "So," he said, easing the car into traffic. "Which direction?" Annie pointed ahead. 2 lights down, then left. Richard followed the instructions. The city outside shifted gradually as they drove. The polished storefronts of downtown gave way to smaller businesses. Neon signs flickered above convenience stores and laundromats. Apartment buildings replaced office towers. Annie watched everything quietly through the window. After a few minutes, Richard spoke again. You weren't scared riding here alone? Annie shrugged slightly. A little. But you came anyway. Yes. Why? She looked down at her hands. Because my mom was sad. Richard glanced at her briefly. She was worried about missing the dinner? Annie nodded. She kept saying, "He's going to think I didn't care." If Annie's small act of courage touched your heart, take a moment to like this video and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Your support helps this story reach more people, and if you believe kindness and keeping promises still matter, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story. Richard tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The words felt strangely heavy. She tried to stand up, Annie continued. But she got dizzy. And that's when you decided to come here? Yes. Richard shook his head slowly. That was a pretty big decision. Annie thought about that. I guess. The car rolled through another intersection. Streetlights passed in a steady rhythm. Richard studied the small girl sitting beside him. You know, he said, most adults wouldn't go that far to keep a promise. Annie looked puzzled. But promises are important, she said. Richard almost laughed. The simplicity of the statement struck him harder than he expected. In his world, promises were constantly renegotiated, contracts rewritten, partnerships dissolved. But to Annie Brooks, the idea seemed perfectly clear. A promise was a promise. They drove for another minute before Annie spoke again. My mom said you were important. Richard raised an eyebrow. Did she? She said you run big companies. Sometimes. And that you're very busy. That's true. Annie nodded thoughtfully. But she still wanted to meet you. Richard didn't answer immediately. He felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Curiosity, respect, maybe even admiration. Danielle Brooks had no idea her 6-year-old daughter had just ridden across the neighborhood to defend her reputation. Yet somehow Richard suspected she wouldn't be surprised. They stopped at a red light. Annie leaned forward slightly and pointed. Turn right at the next street. Richard followed her directions. The neighborhood had changed again. Smaller houses now lined the sidewalks. Front porches with old wooden steps. Cars parked along narrow streets. Children's bicycles leaned against fences. It was a part of the city Richard rarely visited, not because he avoided it deliberately, but because his life simply moved in different circles, different zip codes, different realities. Almost there, Annie said. Richard slowed the car. Which house? The blue one. A small 2-story home appeared on the right side of the street. The porch light glowed warmly against the darkening sky. Richard pulled the car to the curb. The engine fell silent. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Annie unbuckled her seatbelt. My mom might still be sleeping, she said softly. Richard nodded. That's okay. He stepped out of the car and retrieved the bicycle from the trunk. Annie walked up the short path toward the house. Halfway to the porch, she turned back to look at him. Thank you for not being mad, she said. Richard leaned lightly against the car door. I'm not mad, he replied. Annie smiled. Then she climbed the porch steps and opened the door. Inside the house, a faint light flickered from the living room. Richard followed a few steps behind. He had no idea what he was about to walk into, but somehow he already knew this night was going to change something. Maybe not his business, maybe not his wealth, but something far more personal. And sometimes, Richard realized, the smallest decisions were the ones that changed a life. The front door opened into a modest living room that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and something warm like onions sautéed earlier in the day, or soup that had been planned but never finished. Annie stepped inside first, pushing the door gently as if she didn't want to wake the whole house. The porch light spilled in behind her, catching the edges of family photographs on the wall and a small stack of library books on a side table. Richard followed a few steps behind, suddenly aware of how large he must look in the doorway. His shoes were polished. His coat was expensive. His presence alone could change the temperature in a room. Annie turned back and lifted a finger to her lips. Shh, she whispered. She's asleep, I think. Richard nodded once, lowering his voice instinctively. Okay. The house was quiet in the way working families' houses often were quiet, not because nothing happened there, but because the people inside were exhausted from making life happen all day. The furniture was older but well cared for. The carpet showed wear in the center, where feet had passed 1,000 times. A crocheted blanket lay neatly folded over the back of the couch. On the far wall, a child's drawing was taped beside a calendar. The drawing showed 3 stick figures holding hands under a sun. One of the figures had a crown, Richard's eyes lingered on it for a moment. Annie noticed. "That's me and Mom," she said softly. "And that's him." "Who's him?" Richard asked. Annie shrugged, as if the answer were obvious. "A dad." Like in movies, Richard's throat tightened in a way that surprised him. He looked away before the emotion could show on his face. From somewhere deeper in the house, a cough echoed, rough, strained, followed by a faint groan. Annie's shoulders lifted with worry. She moved quickly down a short hallway. "This way," she whispered, and Richard followed. At the end of the hall was a bedroom with the door half open. A dim lamp glowed on a nightstand, its light soft and tired. The room was small, but tidy. A basket of folded laundry sat near the foot of the bed, half put away. On the dresser, a framed picture of Annie in a school uniform smiled back at the world. And on the bed, under a pile of blankets, lay Danielle Brooks. She was turned slightly to one side, one arm thrown over her forehead. Her skin had the sheen of fever, and her breathing was shallow and uneven. She looked too warm and too cold at the same time, like her body didn't know which direction to go. Richard stopped in the doorway. For a brief second, he expected her to look up, to smile, to say something that would make this whole night less strange. Instead, Danielle coughed again, harder this time, and her eyes fluttered open. She blinked once, unfocused. Then she saw Annie. "Baby?" Her voice was hoarse. Where were you?" Annie rushed to the bedside, careful and quick. "I'm here, Mom." Danielle tried to sit up, but the movement made her wince. Then her eyes shifted. She saw Richard. In the lamplight, his silhouette was unmistakable. Tall, broad shoulders, the kind of presence that usually belonged on magazine covers, not in the hallway of her home. Danielle froze. For one long second, her face went blank with disbelief. Then it filled with panic. "Oh my God," she whispered, voice cracking. No. She pushed herself upright again and immediately swayed, dizzy. Richard took a step forward on instinct. "Don't get up," he said gently. "You're sick." Danielle stared at him as if her fever had started hallucinating. "Mr. Cole?" she whispered. Richard's expression tightened. He hadn't expected his name to sound so formal in this house. In his world, people said it with smooth confidence. Here it sounded like something heavy, like a word that didn't belong. "Yes," he said carefully. "Richard." Danielle's eyes snapped to Annie. "Annie, what did you do?" Annie's chin lifted, brave and small. "I told him you were sick." Danielle's hand flew to her mouth. "Annie, you can't." She coughed again, turning her head, fighting for breath. Richard moved closer without thinking, his body reacting before his mind could argue. He picked up a glass of water from the nightstand, held it out. Danielle hesitated, pride warring with weakness. But another cough forced her decision. She took the glass with trembling fingers and sipped. When she lowered it, her eyes were wet. "I'm so sorry," she whispered to Richard. "I swear to you, I wasn't trying to be rude." "I didn't. You don't have to apologize," Richard interrupted quietly. Danielle blinked. "I do. I was supposed to meet you and You got sick," Richard said, calm and steady. "That's not a character flaw." Something flickered across Danielle's face, relief, maybe, but also humiliation. Annie crawled carefully onto the edge of the bed and tucked the blanket around her mother the way a nurse might. Richard watched that small gesture and felt a strange pressure behind his eyes. Children were not supposed to take care of their parents. Yet Annie did it like it was normal, like she had done it before. Danielle's gaze returned to Richard, sharper now despite the fever. "How did you?" she swallowed. "How did you end up here?" Richard glanced at Annie. "She found me at the restaurant." Danielle's eyes widened in horror. "At Romano's?" Annie nodded. "You told me where it was, Mom." Danielle let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Oh, Lord." She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing through the shame. Richard felt the urge to step back, to give her privacy, to pretend he hadn't seen her like this, vulnerable, sick, unraveling. In his world, people hid weakness behind perfect tailoring and polite smiles. But Danielle couldn't hide it, and Annie had refused to let her. Danielle opened her eyes again, looking directly at him now. "Did she ride her bike there?" she asked. voice thin. Richard's jaw tightened. Yes. Danielle's face fell. Annie. I locked it, Annie said quickly, as if that fixed everything. I was careful. Danielle's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment she looked less like a mother and more like a woman fighting exhaustion with every breath. You could have been hurt, Danielle whispered. You could have. I know, Annie said softly. But you were sad. Danielle stared at her daughter like she didn't know whether to cry or scold. Richard stood quietly, watching this exchange unfold. He felt like an intruder in something sacred, this raw bond between a mother and child. This tiny household held together by love and routine and sheer determination. Danielle looked back at Richard again. People are going to think. She stopped, swallowing the rest of the sentence. Richard understood anyway. People were always going to think something. They always did. In his mind, he heard the voices from the restaurant, the whispers, the assumptions. A child like that doesn't belong here. This must be a scam. Call security. Richard had heard those tones before, even when people tried to make them sound polite. He looked at Danielle and felt something settle inside him, something more solid than shock. A decision. I'm not leaving you to deal with this alone, he said. Danielle frowned, confused. What do you mean? Richard took a slow breath, and for the first time that night, his thoughts slipped briefly into a private, first-person truth he would never admit out loud in a boardroom. I have money, influence, lawyers, a name that opens doors. And she has a fever and a 6-year-old who thinks promises are life and death. He looked back at Danielle, his voice calm. I mean, he said, I'm here now. Let's make sure you're okay. Danielle's eyes searched his face, trying to read the hidden motive that rich men were rumored to have. But Richard didn't offer explanations. He simply asked, Do you have medicine? A thermometer? Danielle hesitated. I think so. In the kitchen cabinet. I'll get it, Richard said. Annie's eyes widened. You're going to our kitchen? Richard glanced at her and almost smiled. I think I can handle it. Annie nodded solemnly, as if granting permission. Richard turned toward the hallway, then paused and looked back at Danielle. And Danielle, she blinked. Yes? He spoke gently. With the quiet respect older Americans recognized immediately, the respect that said you were still a person even when you were at your worst. You didn't break your promise, Richard said. You got caught in the kind of life that doesn't give people days off. That's not the same thing. Danielle's throat moved like she was trying not to cry. Annie leaned closer to her mother and whispered, See? I told you he was good. Richard stepped out into the hallway toward the kitchen, hearing the soft murmur of Annie talking to her mother behind him. The house felt small, but it held something his penthouse never had. Warmth, history, a kind of dignity money couldn't purchase. And as he walked toward the kitchen cabinets, Richard Cole realized the night was no longer about a missed dinner reservation. It was about what a person did when the world tried to shame the vulnerable. Richard found the kitchen by following the faint glow of a single overhead light and the soft ticking of a wall clock. The sound was steady, patient, like the house itself had learned to keep time in small, manageable pieces. The kitchen was modest but orderly. A dish rack sat by the sink with 2 plates drying. A half-full cereal box rested on the counter beside a jar of peanut butter. On the refrigerator, magnets held up a child's spelling test. A hospital shift schedule with Danielle's name written in neat block letters, and a worn flyer for a neighborhood health clinic. Richard paused for half a second, absorbing what the paper trail said without words. This home ran on routines, hard work, and whatever was left after that. He opened a cabinet and found a small plastic bin labeled First Aid and Marker. Inside were the usual: adhesive bandages, antiseptic wipes, a digital thermometer, a box of tissues, and a bottle of acetaminophen. Next to it, a smaller bottle of cough syrup. Richard carried the bin back down the hallway like it was something precious. In the bedroom, Annie sat on the edge of the bed, her legs dangling, one hand rubbing her mother's arm in slow circles. Danielle's face was flushed, her eyes shining with fever and embarrassment. When Richard walked in, Danielle tried to sit up again, stubborn pride pulling her forward. Don't, Richard said firmly, not unkindly. You're going to make yourself worse. Danielle froze, then let her shoulders slump back against the pillows. "I'm sorry," she whispered, as if apologies were the only language she had left. Richard set the bin on the nightstand. "You already said that." "I didn't mean to," Danielle began. "I know," he said. Then, softer. "Let's just take care of the fever first." He handed the thermometer to Annie. "Do you know how to use this?" Annie nodded, serious. "Under the tongue. Wait until it beeps." Richard glanced at Danielle, checking for agreement before letting Annie do it. Danielle gave a tiny nod, eyes tired. Annie slid the thermometer gently into her mother's mouth, then watched it like a scientist monitoring an experiment. Richard unscrewed the acetaminophen, reading the dosage instructions carefully. He wasn't used to uncertainty about basic things. In his world, there were assistants, staff, experts, but here, there was only what you could do with your own hands. The thermometer beeped. Annie pulled it out and squinted at the screen. 102.7. Danielle closed her eyes, exhaling through her nose. It felt worse. Richard felt a prickle of concern. "That's high. It's just a fever," Danielle muttered. Richard didn't miss the way she tried to minimize it, like she couldn't afford the luxury of being truly ill. He poured water into the glass from the nightstand pitcher. "You need to take something." Danielle's eyes opened, wary. "You don't have to." "Yes," Richard said, cutting through the protest with calm certainty. "I do." He placed 2 tablets in her palm, then held the water steady. Danielle took them with a swallow that looked like it hurt her throat. Annie watched closely, then asked in a small voice, "Will she be okay?" Richard hesitated only a moment. "She will be if she rests and drinks enough fluids." Danielle gave a weak laugh. "Rest. That's funny." Richard looked at her. "Why is that funny?" Danielle's gaze slid away. "Because if I don't go to work, I don't get paid. If I don't get paid, rent doesn't care that I had a fever." Richard felt the words hit him harder than he expected. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't said with bitterness. It was just the truth. Annie's fingers tightened around the blanket. "Mom always goes, even when she's sick." Danielle tried to smile at her daughter. "I'm fine." Richard sat in the chair beside the bed without asking permission. The chair creaked, old wood complaining under his weight. "You walked home in the rain?" he asked. Danielle's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Annie told you that?" "She did." Danielle rubbed her forehead, as if trying to rewind the day. "The bus was late. Then the train was delayed. By the time I got off, it was coming down in sheets." Richard kept his voice neutral. "You didn't have a ride?" Danielle gave a faint, humorless shrug. "It's not like I have a car service waiting for me." The words weren't meant as an insult, but Richard still felt them land. He thought of his driver, his garage, his heated parking space, the ease he rarely noticed. Annie leaned forward. She had an umbrella, but it broke. Danielle shot her daughter a look. "Annie, it did." Annie insisted, loyal to facts. "And you gave it to Mrs. Johnson because she didn't have one." Danielle closed her eyes, and for a second she looked like she might cry or laugh or do both. Richard studied her face, the lines of exhaustion that didn't belong on someone still young enough to have hope in her eyes. "You were excited about tonight," he said quietly. Danielle opened her eyes. Annie answered for her, unable to contain it. She practiced in the mirror. Danielle groaned softly. "Annie, please." "She did," Annie insisted. She said, "Hi, I'm Danielle. It's nice to meet you." And then she kept saying it again until it sounded right. Richard's chest tightened. Danielle's cheeks flushed deeper. Partly fever, partly humiliation. "That's not, I mean." She coughed, a rough sound that shook her. Richard waited until the cough passed, then spoke gently. "It's not something to be embarrassed about." Danielle stared at him like she didn't believe he could mean it. "I haven't been on a date in a long time," she admitted in a whisper, as if confessing weakness. "I told myself I wouldn't do this. I told myself I didn't have time." Richard's eyes flicked to Annie, then back to Danielle. "And then you agreed anyway." Danielle swallowed. "My friend said you weren't like the others." Richard almost smiled. "The others?" Danielle's mouth twitched. but her eyes stayed serious. Men who hear where I live and suddenly forget how to text back. Men who say they respect hard work until they see what hard work actually looks like. Richard felt the room get smaller. Annie watched him, studying him the way children do, like they could see the truth behind polite words. Richard didn't defend himself. He simply asked, "Did you think I would do that?" Danielle hesitated. Honesty fought with pride. "I didn't know," she said finally. "I didn't know anything. That's why I practiced, because I didn't want to show up sounding nervous and small." Annie reached over and pressed her hand to Danielle's. "You're not small." Danielle's eyes softened. "Baby." "I know." Richard's gaze dropped to their hands. A mother, feverish and fragile. A child, steady and fierce. He thought of the restaurant again, the way people had looked at Annie, the assumption in their whispers. He heard it in his head like a bitter echo. "She doesn't belong here." Richard leaned back in the chair, feeling something harden into clarity. "Danielle," he said, his voice low and controlled. "I need to ask you something, and you can tell me to mind my business." Danielle's eyes narrowed slightly. "Okay. How often do you have to fight to be treated like a person?" The question hung between them. Danielle didn't answer right away. Her face shifted through something older than tonight. Years of swallowed anger, careful patience, exhausted dignity. Then she gave a small, tired smile. "Every day," she said. "But you learn to carry it quietly, because making noise comes with consequences." Richard felt the weight of those words settle into him. In his world, making noise was power. In hers, it was danger. Annie's voice cut in, small and earnest. "That's why I came, so nobody would talk bad about her." Danielle turned her head, tears finally spilling. "Oh, baby." Annie climbed carefully closer, wrapping her arms around her mother's shoulders in a gentle hug that looked practiced. Richard looked away, feeling something unsteady inside him. He had walked into this house thinking he would deliver a message back to normal life. Instead, normal life was beginning to feel like a lie. Danielle wiped her eyes, then looked at Richard again, wary. "You really didn't have to come here." Richard met her gaze. "Maybe I did." The words surprised even him. He wasn't a man who spoke without calculation, but this wasn't business. This was human. He glanced at the medicine on the nightstand, the thermometer, the water glass. Then he looked at Annie. "Do you have any soup?" he asked her. Annie shook her head. "Mom was going to make some, but then she got sick." Richard nodded once, as if confirming a plan. "I'm going to make some," he said. "Or I'm going to find some. Either way, you're both going to eat something." Danielle blinked, caught between gratitude and disbelief. "Richard," he stood, already moving. "Just rest." As he stepped into the hallway again, he heard Annie whisper something to her mother, soft, triumphant. "I told you he was good." Richard walked toward the kitchen with the strange awareness that the night had crossed a line. He wasn't here as a billionaire, not as an investor, not as a name. He was here as a man standing in a house where dignity was fought for daily, and where a 6-year-old girl believed promises were worth peddling across the city to protect. Richard found a pot in the lower cabinet beneath the stove, its handle slightly loose, the bottom scratched from years of honest use. He set it on the burner like it was a small ceremony, something ordinary that mattered because it was being done for someone else. He opened the refrigerator. Inside were the basics: milk, eggs, a jar of pickles, a half lemon in a plastic container, a carton of chicken broth, and a small package of cut vegetables, carrots, celery, onions wrapped in store plastic. On the top shelf sat a paper bowl with a sticky note on it that said, in neat handwriting, "Annie's lunch." Richard's eyes lingered on the note for half a heartbeat. Then he reached for the broth. He moved with quiet efficiency, the same focus he brought to meetings, only now it was applied to a kitchen that was not his. He poured broth into the pot, added vegetables, and turned the flame low. The scent rose almost immediately, humble and comforting. From down the hallway, he could hear Danielle cough once, then settle. Annie's voice followed, soft, reassuring, too practiced for someone so young. Richard turned off the overhead light and left the small lamp on instead, letting the kitchen feel gentler. He found a cutting board, a dull knife, and a clove of garlic tucked in a corner basket. His mother, years ago, had sworn garlic fixed everything. Richard didn't know if that was true, but he wanted to believe it tonight. He chopped carefully anyway. As the soup began to simmer, his phone buzzed. A string of notifications lit the screen. Unknown numbers, a text from his assistant, and a message from his friend, the one who had set the date. Richard stared at the screen for a moment, already knowing what it would say. His friend had probably received the first frantic calls from Romano's, or seen the first blurry video. He opened the message. "Rich, what happened? Call me, now." Richard exhaled through his nose and set the phone face down on the counter. Not yet. Not while the soup was starting. Not while a 6-year-old was sitting at her mother's bedside trying to hold an entire world together. He leaned against the counter, listening to the gentle bubbling. The clock ticked, and for the first time in years, time felt like something you could hear. Footsteps padded into the kitchen. Richard looked up. Annie stood in the doorway, her backpack now set aside, her jacket unzipped. She held her hands together like she was trying to decide whether she was allowed to speak. "She fell asleep," Annie whispered. Richard nodded. "Good." Annie stepped closer, eyes on the pot. "What's that?" "Soup," Richard said. "Chicken soup. The kind people make when someone's sick." Annie's face softened. "Mom likes soup. Then we're in luck," Richard said. Annie watched the pot as if it were a magic trick. After a moment, she asked, "Are you really a billionaire?" Richard paused. He was used to adults asking the question with greed or calculation. With Annie, it sounded like curiosity, like asking whether the moon was far away. "I suppose so," he said carefully. Annie blinked. "Like $1,000? Richard almost smiled. "More than that." Annie's eyes widened. "1 million? More." She did the math in her head and gave up, looking offended at numbers that refused to behave. "That's too much." Richard felt a quiet laugh rise in his chest, but it didn't escape. Not fully. "You know," he said, turning down the flame, "money is just a tool. It can't fix everything." Annie looked at him like she wasn't sure that was true. Then she said something that landed sharper than he expected. "Mom says money can fix a lot, but it doesn't fix how people look at you." Richard's breath caught slightly. "What do you mean?" he asked. Annie shrugged, small shoulders lifting. "People act different when they see us." Us. The word was simple, but it drew a line. Richard had crossed many lines tonight. Wealth to poverty, comfort to discomfort. But Annie's sentence carved a deeper boundary. The one that followed people everywhere, whether they asked for it or not. Richard turned back to the soup to give himself a second. He stirred slowly. Annie continued, quieter. "At the restaurant. That man wanted me out." Richard nodded. "I noticed. He didn't even know me," Annie said. But he already decided. Richard didn't answer immediately. His mind flashed to the dining room again. The way the manager's face tightened. The way one couple had watched Annie like she might steal silverware. The way a man had suggested calling the police as casually as ordering dessert. Richard's jaw clenched. He had spent years believing he understood power. Tonight he saw another kind. The power to decide who belonged and who didn't, and to make those decisions without consequence. "Annie," Richard said, turning his attention fully to her. "When you were at the restaurant, did anyone touch you? Try to grab you?" Annie shook her head quickly. "No, they just talked." Richard felt a cold relief. "Good," he said. "That's good." Annie looked up at him. "Were you mad?" Richard met her gaze. "At you?" "No." Annie looked down. "Mom's going to be mad." Richard considered his words. "She's going to be scared," he corrected. "Mad comes after. Fear comes first. That's usually how it goes when you love someone." Annie seemed to understand that in a way children sometimes do, not with logic but with the truth of experience. She nodded slowly. The soup simmered a little louder, as if reminding them both there were still practical things to do. Richard tasted the broth with a clean spoon. It was simple, but it would work. He found 2 bowls in the cabinet and warmed them with hot water. Then he filled one with soup and placed a few crackers on a small plate beside it. He poured another glass of water and set it all on a tray that looked like it had belonged to Danielle's grandmother. Richard carried the tray down the hallway. Annie followed, quiet as a shadow. In the bedroom, Danielle was asleep, her breathing still uneven but calmer. Her face looked softer in rest, less guarded. The fever had not broken, but the medicine had at least taken the edge off. Richard set the tray on the nightstand. Annie climbed gently onto the edge of the bed again and brushed her fingers across her mother's hairline. Danielle stirred and opened her eyes. The moment she saw Richard, she looked startled, as if she had hoped he was a dream that would vanish when she woke. "Oh," she whispered, voice rough. "You're still here." Richard's tone stayed gentle but steady. "I made soup." Danielle pushed herself up slightly, then winced. "You made soup?" she repeated, as if the words didn't fit together. Richard nodded. "It's not complicated, just broth and vegetables." Danielle's eyes filled with something that looked dangerously close to tears. She blinked fast, fighting them back, dignity hanging on by a thread. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, the apology returning like a reflex. Richard sat in the chair. "Danielle, stop apologizing." Danielle stared at him. He continued, voice calm, the kind of calm older people trusted because it carried respect, not control. "You got sick because you worked hard and you got caught in the rain," he said. "Your daughter came because she didn't want you to be judged. That's not something to be ashamed of." Danielle's gaze flicked to Annie, who was watching her mother carefully. Danielle's face softened, then broke. She reached out and pulled Annie close, holding her with a trembling strength. "You scared me," Danielle whispered into her daughter's hair. "Do you hear me? You scared me." Annie's voice was muffled against her mother. "I'm sorry." Danielle pulled back just enough to look at her. "You cannot do that again." Annie nodded solemnly. Richard watched, his throat tightening. He found himself thinking without intending to that Annie had done what many grown men in his world never did. She had shown up. She had stood in front of strangers and told the truth. She had fought for her mother's dignity with nothing but her small body and her brave voice. Danielle wiped her face and looked at Richard again, guardedness returning, but weaker now. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. The question wasn't accusatory. It was tired. It was the question of someone who had learned that kindness often came with conditions. Richard held her gaze. For a second, his thoughts slipped inward, private, almost dangerous in their honesty. "Because I watched you be judged before you spoke a word. Because I've been in rooms full of powerful people and never felt as ashamed as I did when they looked at your child like she was trouble." But he didn't say all of that. Not yet. Instead, he said the only truth he could offer without turning it into something performative. "Because you're sick," he answered. "And because Annie asked me not to think you didn't care." Danielle swallowed, emotion working behind her eyes. "I did care," she said softly. "I cared too much. That's why I wanted tonight to go right." Richard nodded. "Then let it go right in a different way." Danielle let out a breath that sounded like she'd been holding it all day. Annie picked up the spoon and looked at her mother. "You have to eat." Danielle gave a weak smile. Bossy. Annie didn't apologize this time. She simply held the bowl steady while Danielle took the first few bites. Richard sat quietly, watching them. The room lit by the small lamp. The world outside suddenly very far away, and in that quiet, he felt something settle into place. This wasn't a charity moment. This wasn't a headline. This was a crossroads, one that would ask him, sooner than he was ready, what kind of man he actually was when no one was clapping. Richard stayed in the chair beside the bed long after Danielle finished the soup. The room had grown quiet again, the kind of quiet that settles when the body finally begins to rest. The medicine had taken some of the fever's edge away, and Danielle leaned back against the pillows with heavy eyelids. Annie sat curled beside her, tracing circles on the blanket with one finger. The lamp cast a soft yellow light across the room, and outside the window the neighborhood had slipped into night. Danielle set the empty bowl carefully on the nightstand. "That was good," she said quietly. Richard gave a small nod. "It's not exactly restaurant quality." "It doesn't need to be," Danielle replied. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Danielle looked toward Annie. "Sweetheart, can you go brush your teeth? It's late." Annie hesitated. Her eyes moved from her mother to Richard and back again. "But 5 minutes," Danielle said gently. "I promise I'll still be here." Annie studied her face like she was measuring the promise. Then she slid off the bed and padded toward the hallway bathroom. When her footsteps disappeared, the room grew even quieter. Danielle looked down at her hands. "I'm embarrassed," she admitted. Richard leaned back slightly in the chair. "You don't have to be." "I do." she said softly. You had expectations tonight. A normal evening. A dinner. Richard thought about that. About the candlelit table at Romano's. About the careful wine list. About the quiet life he had planned before Annie walked through the door. Yes, he said honestly. I did. Danielle nodded, accepting the truth. I ruined it. Richard studied her for a moment. You didn't ruin anything, he said. Danielle raised an eyebrow slightly. You're very kind. No, Richard replied calmly. Just honest. She looked unconvinced. Richard folded his hands loosely together. You know what I expected tonight? He asked. Danielle shook her head. Polite conversation, he said. Two people trying to decide whether they had enough in common to justify a second dinner. Danielle's mouth curved faintly. That sounds about right. But instead, Richard continued, a 6-year-old girl rode a bicycle across the neighborhood to defend her mother's reputation. Danielle closed her eyes for a second. Please don't remind me. I'm not criticizing her. I know, Danielle sighed. But she could have gotten hurt. Richard nodded slowly. Yes, he agreed. She could have. They both sat with that truth for a moment. Then Richard said quietly, but that's not the part that stayed with me. Danielle looked up. The part that stayed with me, he said, was that she thought it was her responsibility. Danielle's shoulders sank slightly. That's what happens when you raise a child alone, she said. They see more than you want them to see. Richard didn't interrupt. Danielle continued, her voice steady but tired. She knows when the bills are tight. She knows when I'm stressed. She knows when I pretend I'm not. She gave a weak laugh. Children notice everything. Richard glanced toward the hallway where Annie had disappeared. She's a brave kid. Danielle's expression softened. Yes, she said quietly. She is. For a moment the room felt peaceful. Then Danielle shifted slightly and winced. Richard noticed immediately. Are you cold? A little. Richard stood and gently adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. The gesture was simple, but Danielle looked surprised by it. You don't have to. I know, he said again. Danielle studied him carefully. You're not what I expected, she said. Richard smiled faintly. That seems to be a theme tonight. Danielle looked toward the ceiling for a moment, gathering her thoughts. When my friend told me about you, she said slowly. She said you were powerful. Richard didn't react. She said you owned companies, buildings, investments, things most people only read about. That's mostly true, Richard admitted. Danielle's gaze returned to him. So I assumed you'd be different. Different how? Danielle hesitated. Colder, she said honestly. Richard considered that. I probably am sometimes. Danielle shook her head slightly. Not tonight. Richard leaned back into the chair again. Well, he said quietly, tonight isn't about business. Danielle gave a tired smile. No, she agreed. It definitely isn't. A moment later, Annie returned down the hallway. Her hair was slightly messy now, and she carried a small, stuffed rabbit under her arm. Teeth brushed, she announced proudly. Danielle patted the bed beside her. Come here. Annie climbed up carefully and leaned against her mother's side. Her eyes drifted toward Richard. Are you leaving now? She asked. The question hung in the room longer than it should have. Richard hesitated. He could leave. He could return to the quiet comfort of his penthouse, answer his assistant's calls, resume the rhythm of his carefully controlled life. But the thought felt strangely hollow. He looked at Annie. Not yet, he said. Annie seemed satisfied with that answer. Danielle watched him quietly. You don't have to stay, she said gently. Richard nodded once. I know. Another silence settled over the room. Then Annie yawned, wide and dramatic. Danielle laughed softly. That's your bedtime, miss, Annie groaned. But no arguments. Annie slid off the bed reluctantly. Danielle pointed toward the hallway. Pajamas, then bed. Annie shuffled away again, her stuffed rabbit dragging along the floor behind her. When she was gone, Danielle looked at Richard once more. You've been very kind tonight, she said. Richard shook his head. Kindness isn't the right word. What is? Richard thought about it. Then he answered quietly. Respect. Danielle held his gaze. Most people talked about respect. Few actually showed it. After a moment, Danielle's eyes softened again. You should go home, she said gently. It's late. Richard glanced at the clock. She was right, but something inside him resisted the idea of leaving this small house behind. He stood slowly. I will, he said. Danielle nodded. Richard walked toward the bedroom door, then paused. He turned back slightly. Danielle. Yes? If the fever doesn't break by morning, he said calmly, you need to see a doctor. Danielle gave a small smile. I work at a clinic. Richard raised an eyebrow. That explains the first aid kit. Danielle chuckled weakly. Perks of the job. Richard nodded. Then he stepped into the hallway. As he reached the living room, he heard Annie's voice from her bedroom. Mom? Yes, baby? Is he coming back? Richard stopped walking. The answer came after a moment. I don't know, Danielle said gently. There was a pause. Then Annie said something small but hopeful. I think he will. Richard stood in the quiet living room for several seconds. Then he stepped out onto the porch, closing the door softly behind him. The night air was cool. His car waited by the curb. His phone buzzed again in his pocket, but Richard Cole remained standing there a moment longer, staring at the dark street, because something had changed tonight. Not the world, not his wealth, but something deeper. And whether he liked it or not, he knew Annie might be right. He might come back. Richard drove home with the radio off. He usually liked silence after a long day. Silence was clean, predictable, but tonight, silence felt crowded. Annie's voice kept slipping back into his mind with that calm, impossible sentence. Mom is sick, so I came instead. At the first red light, he checked his phone. 22 notifications. A text from his assistant. Are you okay? Romanos called. There's a situation. A voicemail from his friend who had arranged the date. Rich, call me. What happened? Did you leave? People are talking. And then, like a bruise you didn't see until you touched it, he noticed the missed calls from an unfamiliar number. Probably Danielle's. Probably a phone found too late. Richard stared at the screen for a moment, then set it back down without answering. Not because he didn't care, because the kind of care he felt tonight didn't fit inside quick replies and polished reassurances. His penthouse greeted him with the soft glow of automated lights and the faint scent of expensive detergent. Everything was in its place, everything quiet, everything designed to be effortless. And yet the first thing Richard noticed was how empty it felt. He hung his coat on the rack and stood still in the entryway, listening. No ticking clock, no child's footsteps, no cough in the back room, just the hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant city beyond the windows. He walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. His reflection in the dark window looked the same as it always did. Well-dressed, controlled, successful. But his eyes didn't look like they usually did. They looked unsettled. He thought of Danielle's question, "Why are you doing this?" And how it hadn't been suspicion. Exactly. It had been experience. The kind of experience that taught you kindness was often transactional. Richard's jaw tightened. He opened his laptop on the kitchen island out of habit, though he didn't need to. A deal briefing sat waiting. Numbers and forecasts that would normally pull him in like gravity. Tonight, it felt meaningless. He closed the laptop again. Then he did something he rarely did at this hour. He called his mother. She answered on the second ring, sleepy but immediate. The way mothers answered, even when their children were grown. Richard? Her voice sharpened. Is everything all right? He hesitated, realizing he didn't know how to summarize tonight in a sentence that didn't sound ridiculous. I'm fine, he said. I had a strange evening. His mother gave a quiet hum, half concern, half patience. Strange how? Richard walked toward the window, looking down at the city lights. A child showed up at my dinner. Silence. Then, softly, a child. Yes. And you're calling me at nearly 10 at night to tell me a child showed up at dinner. His mother's voice carried the hint of a smile. Richard, what really happened? He exhaled. She was 6. A little girl named Annie. She said her mother was sick, and she came instead. His mother didn't speak for a long moment, as if weighing something. Then she said quietly, Did you help them? Richard's throat tightened. Yes. Good, his mother replied, with the simple finality of someone who believed that was the only acceptable answer. Richard stared at the window. People at the restaurant. They looked at her like she was trouble. His mother sighed, a weary sound that carried years. People do that. I know, Richard said. But watching it happen right in front of me made me feel, he searched for the word, ashamed. Ashamed. His mother was quiet again. Finally, she said, Sometimes God puts a person in your path so you can't pretend you don't see. Richard didn't argue. He couldn't. After he hung up, he stood for a long time with the phone still in his hand, the city below him moving as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something that didn't show up on market reports or quarterly earnings. His phone buzzed again. A voicemail from his assistant. He played it. "Mr. Cole, I'm sorry to bother you late, but Romano's is upset. They said there was an incident involving a child. A guest took video. It's starting to circulate. Do you want me to have PR draft something?" Richard closed his eyes. There it was, the machine of reputation, of containment, of carefully crafted statements. He could already hear the language PR would use. Mr. Cole was concerned. Mr. Cole acted out of compassion. Mr. Cole respects the community. Words built like walls. Richard opened the video link his assistant forwarded. The clip was shaky, filmed from behind a wine glass. It captured Annie standing near the host stand, Richard draping his coat around her shoulders. Then the two of them walking toward the door. The caption underneath was worse than the video. "Billionaire saves little girl Promove" or something darker? Richard felt his stomach turn. Comments scrolled fast. Some were kind, some were suspicious, some were cruel in a way that didn't even pretend. What's a kid like that doing in there? Probably begging. Call the cops. He's trying to look good. Where's her mother? This is how it starts. Kids get taken. Richard's hands tightened around the phone, and suddenly he understood Danielle's earlier words in a new light. Making noise comes with consequences. He could ignore it. He could let PR bury it. He could protect the stock of his reputation and move on. But then he saw Annie's face in his mind steady, determined, asking him if he was mad, not because she feared punishment, but because she feared judgment falling on her mother. Richard set the phone down slowly. He walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a notebook paper. Not digital, the kind he used when he needed to think without distraction. He wrote one sentence. Find out what actually happened at Romano's before the story gets written by strangers. Then he wrote another. Make sure Danielle and Annie are protected. He didn't know yet what protected meant in this situation, but he knew what it didn't mean. It didn't mean hiding. He checked the unfamiliar missed call number again. He dialed it. It rang twice. Then a woman answered, voice hoarse and frightened, as if she'd been awake too long. "Hello?" Richard's breath caught. "Danielle," he said softly. "It's Richard Cole." Silence. Then a sharp inhale. "Oh God." "No," Richard said quickly. "No, please. You don't have to apologize." He heard movement on the other end, the rustle of blankets, a small cough that wasn't Danielle's. "Annie." Danielle's voice trembled. "Annie told me what she did. I'm so sorry. I didn't know she'd—" "I know," Richard said. "I'm not calling to scold anyone." Another pause. Heavier. Danielle lowered her voice. "Then why are you calling?" Richard looked out across the city again, the lights like 1,000 indifferent stars. "Because," he said, choosing each word carefully, "people at the restaurant recorded us. The video is online, and the comments are not kind." Danielle was silent for a moment. When she spoke, the strength had drained from her voice. "They're saying things about Annie." "Yes," Richard admitted. A small sound escaped Danielle, part anger, part helplessness. "I can't do this," she whispered. "I can't. I'm sick. And now this. I don't have money for lawyers. I don't have—" "Listen to me," Richard said, voice firm now. The tone that closed deals and ended arguments, but gentled by something real. "You are not alone in this." Danielle didn't answer. Richard continued, slower. "Tomorrow morning, I'm coming by to check on you. Annie too. And we're going to talk about what happens next." Danielle's voice was quiet. "Why would you do that?" Richard felt the question again. Why would you like a test? He didn't want to give her a polished answer, so he gave her the truth. "Because a 6-year-old rode her bike to keep your promise," he said. "And I refuse to let the world punish her for it." He heard Annie's small voice in the background, sleepy but curious. "Mom, is that him?" Danielle's voice softened. "Yes, baby." Annie's voice came closer to the phone. "Hi." Richard's chest tightened. "Hi, Annie," he said gently. "Are you still mad?" she asked. The same question, as if her whole world depended on the answer. Richard swallowed. "No, I'm not mad. A beat. Are you coming back? Annie asked. Richard looked at the notebook on his desk, at the words he had written. Yes, he said. I'm coming back. Annie exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for hours. Okay. Danielle took the phone again, her voice softer now, cautious hope slipping in under fear. All right, she whispered. Tomorrow. Richard confirmed. Get rest. Drink water. And Danielle, yes? His mind flashed to the comments. To the video. To the easy cruelty of strangers. He said the sentence he wanted her to believe, even if she couldn't yet. Justice isn't always fair, Richard said quietly. But that doesn't mean we stop reaching for it. Danielle didn't reply right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than breath. Good night, Richard. Good night, he said. After he hung up, Richard Cole stood alone in his silent penthouse, city lights blinking outside, and felt something settle into place like a final click. This was no longer a strange evening. This was the beginning of a fight, not in a boardroom, not on a balance sheet, but in the quiet space where dignity either survived or was taken. Richard barely slept. Sometime after midnight, he had fallen into a shallow, restless sleep on the couch, the city lights still glowing through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His mind had replayed the evening in fragments, Annie standing in the restaurant doorway, Danielle pale under the lamp, the angry comments scrolling across his phone. When his alarm sounded at 6:30 a.m., he was already awake. For a moment, he simply lay there, staring at the ceiling. In the quiet, the question returned again. What kind of man are you when it costs you something? Richard swung his feet to the floor. By 7:15, he was dressed in dark jeans and a charcoal sweater instead of his usual suit. It wasn't deliberate. It just felt wrong to show up at Danielle's house looking like a board meeting. His phone buzzed as he poured coffee. His assistant. Good morning, Mr. Cole, she said carefully. I assume you've seen the situation online. I have. It's growing. Richard leaned against the counter. How bad? She hesitated. Several major accounts picked it up overnight. The narrative is split. Some people are praising you. Others are questioning your motives. And the restaurant? They issued a statement saying they prioritize the comfort of their guests. Richard's jaw tightened, meaning they think Annie made people uncomfortable, he said flatly. That seems to be the implication. Richard closed his eyes for a moment. Have PR draft something, he said. Of course, but don't release it yet. A pause. Sir, I want to understand what actually happened before we say anything. Yes, Mr. Cole. He hung up before she could ask more questions. 40 minutes later, his Mercedes rolled into Danielle's neighborhood. Morning light had softened the streets. Children waited for school buses. A woman walked a dog past a row of small houses. The blue house appeared exactly where Annie had pointed the night before. Richard parked at the curb. For a moment, he stayed in the car. This was the moment where most people turned around, where good intentions quietly dissolved into busy schedules and comfortable excuses. He stepped out of the car. The porch steps creaked as he climbed them. Before he could knock, the door opened. Annie stood there. She wore oversized pajamas with cartoon stars, her hair loose and wild from sleep. Her eyes widened when she saw him. You came, she said. Richard smiled faintly. I said I would. Behind her, Danielle appeared in the hallway, leaning against the wall for support. The fever still painted her cheeks, but she was upright. You didn't have to come this early, she said. Richard stepped inside. I thought mornings were harder when you're sick. Danielle gave a tired laugh. That's true. Annie shut the door behind him and immediately grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the kitchen like he belonged there. Mom tried to make toast, Annie explained. Richard followed. The kitchen looked the same as the night before, except the toaster sat in the middle of the counter with 2 burned slices of bread beside it. Danielle Sehil. I told her we could just eat cereal. Annie looked offended. Toast is better. Richard examined the blackened bread. This might qualify as charcoal, he said. Annie giggled. For a moment, the tension in the house loosened. Danielle sank slowly into one of the kitchen chairs. You really didn't need to do all this, she said again. Richard leaned against the counter. I know. Danielle studied him carefully. You said something on the phone last night, she said. About the video. Richard nodded. It's circulating online. Danielle closed her eyes briefly. I was afraid of that. Richard pulled out a chair and sat across from her. People are making assumptions. Danielle opened her eyes. They always do. Her voice carried the quiet weight of someone who had seen the pattern too many times. "What kind of assumptions?" she asked. Richard didn't soften it. That Annie didn't belong there, that she must have been begging, that I was trying to make myself look like a hero. Danielle looked down at the table. Her fingers curled into a loose fist. "I knew it," she whispered. Annie looked between them. "What does that mean?" Danielle forced a small smile. "It means people don't always understand things." Annie frowned. "They should ask first." Richard couldn't help it. He smiled. "That's actually a very good rule." Danielle rubbed her forehead. "I don't want Annie dragged into something ugly," she said. Richard leaned forward slightly. "That's exactly why I came." Danielle met his eyes. "What are you planning to do?" Richard paused. In the boardroom, he would have laid out a strategy. Steps, consequences, outcomes. But here it felt different. "I want the truth to be visible," he said. Danielle looked skeptical. "The truth doesn't travel as fast as rumors." Richard nodded. "You're right. So what happens when the internet decides the story for us?" Richard's gaze drifted toward Annie, who had started carefully buttering a new piece of toast. "Then we remind them that there are real people behind the story." Danielle studied him for a long moment. "You really think that works?" Richard answered honestly. "I don't know." The room fell quiet again. Then Annie spoke suddenly. "Mom?" "Yes?" "Did I do something bad?" Danielle's head snapped toward her. "No," she said immediately. "But people are mad." Danielle pushed herself out of the chair and walked over to Annie, kneeling carefully beside her. "Listen to me," she said softly. "You did something brave." Annie looked uncertain. Richard watched the moment unfold. Danielle continued, brushing Annie's hair back from her face. "You were trying to protect me. That's love. That's not something to be ashamed of." Annie nodded slowly. Richard felt something tighten in his chest. Children should not have to defend their parents from strangers. Yet Annie had done it without hesitation. Danielle stood again and faced Richard. "So," she said quietly, "what happens now?" Richard leaned back in his chair. "I'm going to Romano's." Danielle blinked. "The restaurant?" "Yes." "Why?" Richard's expression hardened slightly. "Because someone in that room decided Annie was a problem." Danielle's voice dropped. "They might say it was policy." Richard shrugged. "Then we'll talk about their policy." Danielle studied his face, realizing he meant it. "You're serious?" "I am." Annie's eyes brightened. "Can I come?" Both adults spoke at the same time. "No." Annie crossed her arms. "That's not fair." Richard crouched slightly so he was eye level with her. "Annie, sometimes grown-ups have conversations that aren't very interesting for kids." "That's not true," Annie said. Richard almost laughed. "Fair point," he admitted. "But today, I need you to stay here and take care of your mom." Annie considered this carefully. Finally, she nodded. "Okay." Danielle watched the exchange with quiet amazement. "You're good with her," she said. Richard stood. "She's easy to like." Annie beamed. Richard headed toward the door, then paused. He turned back. "Danielle." "Yes." "If things get worse online today, don't panic." Danielle gave a small, humorless smile. "That's easier said than done." Richard nodded. "I know." He opened the door. Morning sunlight spilled across the porch. As he stepped outside, Annie ran after him. "Richard." He turned. "Yes." She looked at him seriously. "Are you going to fix it?" Richard looked at the small girl standing in the doorway, hair still messy from sleep, belief shining in her eyes. He didn't answer like a billionaire. He answered like a man. "I'm going to try," he said. Annie seemed satisfied. Richard walked down the porch steps and toward his car. Across town, Romano's restaurant had already opened its doors for lunch. And before the day was over, someone inside that building was going to realize the story they started wasn't the story that would finish. Richard arrived at Romano's just before 10. The restaurant looked completely different in the morning light. The candlelit elegance of the night before had been replaced by ordinary daylight. Waiters moved chairs. A delivery truck idled at the curb. Someone inside polished glasses behind the bar. But Richard noticed something else. Two people standing near the window looked up from their phones the moment his car pulled to the curb. They recognized him. Word had already spread. Richard stepped out of the Mercedes and walked toward the entrance. Inside, the same maitre d' from the previous night stood behind the host stand. The man's posture stiffened immediately when he saw Richard. "Mr. Cole," he said quickly, forcing a professional smile. "Good morning." Richard didn't return the smile. "Good morning." The room had gone quiet again. It was the same tension as the night before, but now it carried curiosity instead of annoyance. The maitre d' clasped his hands nervously. I assume you're here about the incident last night. Richard leaned one elbow on the host stand. Yes, he said calmly. I am. The man nodded quickly. We regret any misunderstanding. Our staff was simply trying to maintain the dining experience for our guests. Richard studied his face. What part of a 6-year-old girl asking for help disrupted the dining experience? The maitre d' swallowed. Sir, the child appeared unaccompanied. We have a responsibility to ensure safety. Richard didn't raise his voice, but the calm in it sharpened. Did anyone ask her why she was there? The man hesitated. Our staff attempted to. Did anyone ask? Richard repeated. Silence answered. Richard straightened slightly. She came because her mother was sick, he said. She came because she believed I deserved an explanation. The maitre d' shifted his weight. We weren't aware of the full situation. Richard's gaze hardened. That's exactly the point. A couple sitting near the window had stopped pretending not to listen. The maitre d' lowered his voice. Mr. Cole, we have already issued a statement regarding the situation. Yes, Richard said. I saw it. He pulled out his phone and read the sentence aloud. Romano's prioritizes the comfort of its guests and maintains standards to ensure a refined dining environment. He set the phone back down. Tell me something, Richard said quietly. The man said nothing. Which part of Annie made your guests uncomfortable? The maitre d' opened his mouth, then closed it again. Richard continued. Was it her age? Silence. Or was it something else? The implication hung in the air like a weight. The man's face flushed. That's not fair. Richard's eyes didn't move. No, he said calmly. What wasn't fair was how your staff looked at her. The maitre d' glanced around the room nervously. Sir, people are watching. Richard nodded. I know. He leaned forward slightly, and that's exactly why we're having this conversation here. The manager appeared from the back office then. A heavier man in his 50s with the polished smile of someone used to smoothing problems before they grew. Mr. Cole, the manager said smoothly. I'm Daniel Harris, the general manager. Perhaps we can speak privately. Richard studied him. Sure. They stepped into a small office near the kitchen. The door closed. The sounds of dishes and quiet conversation muffled outside. Harris folded his hands. I understand you're upset. Richard leaned against the desk. I'm interested in understanding what happened. Harris nodded carefully. Our staff saw a child enter alone. That raised concerns. And some guests complained. Richard raised an eyebrow. Complained about what? Harris hesitated. Richard waited. Finally, Harris said, they were concerned she might be asking for money. Richard let out a slow breath. A 6-year-old girl. Harris shifted slightly. You know how people can be. Yes, Richard said quietly. I'm starting to. Harris clasped his hands tighter. Mr. Cole, this situation has already created a lot of online attention. We're hoping to avoid further escalation. Richard looked at him steadily. You mean you want it to go away? That would be ideal. Richard nodded slowly. I see. Harris relaxed slightly, but then Richard spoke again. That's not going to happen. Harris blinked. I'm sorry? Richard's voice remained calm. That little girl walked into this restaurant because she believed adults would treat her fairly. Harris shifted uneasily. And instead, Richard continued, your staff treated her like a problem. Harris raised his hand slightly. We didn't mean. Intent doesn't change the result. Silence filled the office. Richard continued, slower now. Do you know what Annie asked me this morning? Harris shook his head. She asked if I was going to fix it. Harris frowned slightly. And? Richard met his eyes. I told her I would try. Harris leaned back in his chair. What exactly does that mean? Richard didn't hesitate. It means the real story gets told. Harris's expression tightened. And if that damages this restaurant? Richard shrugged slightly. Then perhaps the restaurant should have treated a 6-year-old girl better. Harris stared at him for several seconds. You're serious? Yes. Harris sighed heavily. Mr. Cole, public narratives are complicated. Richard nodded. They are. People online are already arguing about what happened. I know. Harris leaned forward. Sometimes the smartest thing to do is let the noise pass. Richard thought about Annie standing in the doorway, about Danielle apologizing while burning with fever, about the comments calling Annie a beggar. No, Richard said quietly. Sometimes the smartest thing to do is refuse to be quiet. The manager rubbed his temples. "What do you want from us?" Richard answered simply, "The truth." Harris frowned. "What does that look like?" Richard stood upright again. "It looks like acknowledging that a frightened child asked for help and was treated like she didn't belong." Harris didn't respond. Richard stepped toward the door. "And it looks like making sure that never happens here again." He opened the office door. Outside, the dining room had grown noticeably quieter. Several people were pretending to eat while clearly listening. Richard walked calmly toward the exit. As he stepped outside, his phone vibrated again. A notification. The video from last night had crossed 1 million views, and a new headline had just appeared beneath it. "Billionaire confronts restaurant after viral video with little girl." Richard looked at the screen for a moment. Then he slipped the phone into his pocket, because the real story wasn't online yet. But before the day was over, it would be. Richard had barely reached his car when the first reporter appeared. It happened so quickly he almost laughed. A woman in a navy coat stepped onto the sidewalk with a phone already recording. "Mr. Cole, do you have a comment about the video circulating online?" Richard paused with the car door half open. He looked at her calmly. Another reporter jogged across the street, then another. Within seconds, 3 cameras were pointed at him. The story had moved faster than he expected. "Mr. Cole," the first reporter pressed. "People want to know what happened inside the restaurant last night. Was the child abandoned? Were you helping her?" Richard closed the car door slowly and faced them. "The child wasn't abandoned," he said evenly. "Then why was she alone in the restaurant?" "Because she believed adults would listen." The reporters exchanged glances. "Listen to what?" Richard answered simply. "That her mother was sick." The second reporter leaned forward. "So the story is true? The girl came to your date?" "Yes." "Did you know the mother before that moment?" "No." The woman with the phone lowered it slightly. "You're saying you had never met the child or the mother before last night?" "That's correct." A man from a local news station raised his microphone. "Mr. Cole, critics online are suggesting this may have been staged for publicity." Richard didn't react. He had heard accusations like that before in business, but hearing them connected to Annie made something colder settle inside him. "A 6-year-old riding her bicycle across the neighborhood to protect her mother's dignity," he said quietly, "would be a strange publicity strategy." The reporters fell silent for a moment. Then another question came. "Are you planning legal action against the restaurant?" Richard shook his head. "No." "Then what do you want to happen?" Richard glanced briefly back at the restaurant doors behind him. "What I want," he said, "is for people to stop assuming the worst about children they don't know." The first reporter tilted her head. "Are you referring to accusations of discrimination?" Richard met her gaze. "I'm referring to the fact that a frightened child asked for help, and adults responded with suspicion." The cameras stayed on him. Somewhere across the street, another person lifted a phone to record. The story was growing in real time. Richard checked his watch. He had already stayed longer than planned. "I'm not interested in turning this into a spectacle," he said. "But it already is one," the reporter replied. Richard gave a small, tired smile. "Yes," he said. "It seems that way." He opened the car door again. Before he could get in, one final question stopped him. "Mr. Cole, have you spoken to the girl since last night?" Richard paused. "Yes." "And what did she say?" Richard thought about Annie standing in the doorway that morning, her hair messy, her voice serious. "Are you going to fix it?" He looked back at the cameras. "She asked me if I was mad," he said. The reporters waited. "And were you?" Richard shook his head. "No." "Then what did you tell her?" Richard's voice softened. "I told her I was coming back." The reporters looked puzzled. "Coming back where?" Richard slid into the driver's seat. "To her house," he said. The door closed before they could ask another question. The Mercedes pulled away from the curb. Inside the car, Richard's phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't reporters. It was his assistant. "Mr. Cole," she said immediately when he answered. "The video of your statement just went live. It's spreading faster than the first clip." Richard wasn't surprised. "Public reaction?" She hesitated. "Mixed, but shifting." "Shifting how?" "People are starting to ask who the girl is." Richard's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. "That's what I was afraid of. Should we release a statement protecting her identity?" "Yes." "Immediately?" "Yes." There was a pause. "Understood." Richard ended the call. He drove back toward Danielle's neighborhood. But halfway there, another call came through. "Unknown number," he answered. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was tense. "Mr. Cole?" This is Officer Martinez with Chicago Community Police. Richard's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Yes, we've received multiple reports about a viral video involving a minor child. Richard's pulse slowed deliberately. And we need to confirm that the child is safe. Richard exhaled slowly. She is. Can you verify her location? Richard didn't answer immediately, because suddenly he understood something. The internet hadn't just created a story. It had created suspicion, and suspicion always found authority. Officer, Richard said calmly, I'm actually on my way back to her house right now. There was a brief pause. Good, the officer said, because we're sending someone there as well. Richard stared at the road ahead. The quiet morning neighborhood suddenly felt less peaceful in his mind. Why? He asked. Standard procedure when a child becomes part of a public incident. Richard felt the weight of that sentence settle heavily. Annie had wanted to protect her mother from embarrassment. Now the entire city was looking at their front door. Understood, Richard said quietly. He ended the call. The Mercedes accelerated slightly, because suddenly the story had changed again. It wasn't just about a restaurant or the internet. Now it involved the authorities, and Richard had the unsettling feeling that when he arrived, Danielle might not be the only one waiting for him. Richard turned onto Danielle's street just as the police cruiser pulled up. The flashing lights were not on, but the presence of the vehicle alone was enough to turn heads in the quiet neighborhood. A few curtains shifted in nearby windows. Someone across the street slowed their dog-walking pace to watch. Richard parked behind the cruiser and stepped out. A uniformed officer stood near the front porch speaking calmly into a radio. He looked up as Richard approached. You, Mr. Cole? The officer asked. Yes, I'm Officer Martinez. They shook hands briefly. I assume you're here about the Brooks residence, Martinez said. I am. 0. Martinez nodded toward the house. We received several calls after that video started circulating. Some people were concerned about the child. Richard kept his tone measured. She's fine. I figured, Martinez replied. But when something involving a minor goes viral, we have to check. Richard glanced toward the front door. Have you spoken with them yet? Just arrived. Before either man could say more, the front door opened. Danielle stood there. She looked worse than she had that morning. Her hair was tied back hastily, and the fever still lingered in her pale face. Annie stood beside her, clutching the same stuffed rabbit from the night before. Annie's eyes lit up when she saw Richard. You came back. Danielle's gaze shifted immediately to the police cruiser. Her shoulders tensed. What's going on? She asked. Officer Martinez stepped forward, removing his hat respectfully. Ma'am, I'm sorry to disturb you. We received some calls about a child appearing in a viral video. We just need to confirm everything is okay. Daniela blinked. Then she looked at Richard. You said the video was spreading, she said quietly. Richard nodded. I didn't think it would reach this level so quickly. Annie tugged Danielle's sleeve. Mom, am I in trouble? Danielle knelt down immediately despite the effort it took. No, she said firmly, brushing Annie's hair from her face. You didn't do anything wrong. Officer Martinez crouched slightly as well, lowering his voice to Annie's level. Hey there, he said gently. What's your name? Annie. Well, Annie, my job is just to make sure kids are safe. That's all. Annie nodded seriously. I'm safe. Martinez smiled faintly. I can see that. He stood again and looked toward Danielle. Ma'am, if it's all right, I'd like to ask a couple questions. Danielle slowly rose to her feet, one hand resting on the doorframe for balance. That's fine. Richard stepped closer to the porch but stayed quiet. Martinez spoke calmly. Last night, your daughter appeared alone at a restaurant across town. Can you explain what happened? Danielle sighed softly. She overheard me talking about a dinner I had planned, Danielle said. I got sick and couldn't go. She thought the man waiting would think I didn't care. Martinez glanced at Annie. So she decided to go herself. Danielle nodded. Yes. Annie lifted her chin proudly. I rode my bike. Martinez tried not to smile. That must have taken some courage. Annie shrugged as if it were obvious. Danielle looked embarrassed again. I didn't know she'd left until later. Martinez nodded. Did she leave without your permission? Yes. Danielle looked at Annie briefly, but her tone softened. Because she was trying to protect me. The officer turned toward Richard. And you met her there. Richard nodded. She approached the host's stand and asked for me by name. Martinez raised his eyebrows slightly. That must have been a surprise. It was. The officer looked between them. From what I can tell, the child wasn't harmed and there's no neglect involved. Danielle let out a breath she had clearly been holding. Thank you. Martinez tipped his hat slightly. Just doing my job. But before he turned to leave, he glanced at Richard again. You might want to prepare them, he said quietly. For what? Martinez nodded toward the street. Richard followed his gaze. 2 more cars had slowed near the curb. Not police. Media vans. And people with cameras were already stepping out. Danielle saw them too. Her shoulders stiffened. Oh no, she whispered. Annie looked confused. Who are those people? Richard stepped forward onto the porch beside Danielle. Reporters, he said calmly. Danielle looked overwhelmed. I can't deal with this, she said. I'm sick, and Annie doesn't need. Richard raised a hand gently. You won't face them alone. Danielle turned toward him. Richard, this is your world, not mine. He shook his head. Not today. The first reporter was already approaching the sidewalk. Camera ready. Microphone raised. Miss Brooks, is it true your daughter went looking for a billionaire alone last night? Danielle froze. Annie squeezed her hand tightly. Richard stepped forward before Danielle could speak. His voice carried across the small front yard, calm but firm. That's enough. The reporter stopped. Mr. Cole, can we get a statement? Richard looked directly at the camera. You already have the story, he said, but you're telling it wrong. The microphones lifted higher. The camera light blinked red, and suddenly the quiet blue house on a modest Chicago street became the center of the story everyone wanted. Behind him, Annie whispered to her mother, Is he fixing it? Danielle looked at Richard standing between them and the cameras. For the first time that morning, hope flickered in her tired eyes. Maybe, she whispered. The cameras lifted higher. 3 reporters now stood near the sidewalk. Microphones pointed toward the porch. A 4th person held a phone horizontally, already streaming. The quiet street had transformed in minutes. Neighbors peeked through curtains. Someone across the street stepped onto their lawn pretending to water plants. Danielle's grip on Annie's hand tightened. Richard stepped forward 1 pace, positioning himself between them and the cameras without making a show of it. His voice remained calm, but it carried the authority of someone used to being heard. You already have the story, he said again, but you're telling it wrong. The first reporter leaned forward immediately. Then tell us the right version, Mr. Cole. Richard paused, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he wanted every word to land. Behind him, Annie watched him with quiet attention. The same question still sat in her eyes. Are you fixing it? Richard looked directly into the nearest camera. Last night, he said, a 6-year-old girl came into a restaurant looking for me. A reporter interrupted. Alone. Yes, Richard said. Alone. Another microphone pushed forward. Why was she alone? Richard answered plainly. Because her mother was sick and couldn't make it to dinner. The reporters scribbled notes. One of them spoke quickly. Why didn't the mother call you? Danielle shifted behind him, embarrassed. Richard didn't let the question reach her. She tried, he said. Then he added quietly, but when you're a single mother working long shifts, sometimes life doesn't cooperate with your plans. The reporters exchanged glances. The tone of the story had already started to shift. Another voice cut in. Mr. Cole, people online are questioning whether the situation was staged. Richard let out a slow breath. A 6-year-old riding a bicycle across her neighborhood to defend her mother's dignity, he said, would be a strange publicity stunt. A couple of reporters lowered their eyes slightly, but one persisted. Then why did the restaurant react the way it did? Richard didn't hesitate. Because assumptions are powerful. Silence spread briefly. He continued. When Annie walked into that room, people didn't see a brave child. He glanced back at Annie briefly. They saw a problem. The cameras stayed fixed on him. Did the restaurant discriminate against her? Another reporter asked. Richard chose his words carefully. I'm not here to accuse anyone of anything. A small pause. But I am here to say this. He looked back at the reporters. When adults see a child alone, the first instinct should be concern. His voice sharpened slightly. Not suspicion. The statement landed heavier than anything before it. A reporter lowered her microphone. Another reporter looked toward Danielle. Miss Brooks, he asked, did you know your daughter was going to the restaurant? Danielle hesitated. Her voice came out quiet but steady. No. Were you worried? Danielle gave a small laugh that carried exhaustion. I was terrified. A few reporters softened visibly. Danielle continued. But she didn't go there to cause trouble. She placed a hand on Annie's shoulder. She went because she thought someone deserved the truth. The cameras shifted toward Annie. Annie froze slightly under the attention. Richard stepped forward again, subtly blocking the direct view. "She's 6, he said. "Let's keep the cameras off her." To their credit, most of the reporters lowered their lenses slightly. One of them spoke again. "Mr. Cole, what happens now?" Richard looked around the quiet street, the blue house, the curious neighbors, the reporters, and behind him, a mother still burning with fever and a child who believed promises mattered. "This story shouldn't be about me," he said, "or even about the restaurant." The reporters waited. "It should be about something much simpler." He paused. "How we treat people we don't know." The microphones hovered again, especially children. Another question came quickly. "Mr. Cole, will you continue seeing Miss Brooks?" Danielle's eyes widened slightly. The question was blunt. Richard glanced at her. Then he smiled faintly. "I think that decision belongs to Danielle." A few reporters chuckled quietly. Danielle looked both amused and overwhelmed. The mood had shifted. But Richard wasn't finished. "One more thing," he said. The reporters lifted their microphones again. "If you're going to tell this story," he gestured slightly toward Annie, "tell it right." "What's the right version?" someone asked. Richard answered without hesitation. "A little girl believed adults would be fair." He paused. "Now we all get to prove whether she was right." Silence followed. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then the reporters slowly began lowering their microphones. The tension in the yard eased. Annie tugged Danielle's sleeve again. "Mom?" "Yes, baby?" "Did he fix it?" Danielle looked at Richard standing on the porch. The reporters were already backing away, whispering to each other. Some of them even looked thoughtful. Danielle squeezed Annie's hand. "Not all the way," she said softly. "But he started." Richard stepped back toward them. The cameras were leaving. But he knew something else was coming. Because when a story touched the internet like this, it didn't end quickly. And before the day was over, someone far more powerful than reporters was going to notice. The reporters left the street slowly, but the story didn't leave with them. Within an hour, it had spread far beyond the neighborhood. By noon, Richard's assistant called again. "Mr. Cole, the clip from the porch is everywhere." Richard stood in Danielle's small living room while Annie colored quietly on the coffee table. "Define everywhere," he said. "National feeds," she replied. Morning shows picked it up. Several civil rights organizations are reposting the video. Richard glanced at Danielle. She sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, watching Annie draw tiny stars around a stick figure. "What are they saying?" he asked. "Most of the coverage is sympathetic," his assistant said. "But there's a second wave building." Richard knew exactly what that meant. "And some business commentators are questioning your involvement." Richard smiled faintly. "They usually do." But his assistant hesitated. "This one is different." Richard walked toward the kitchen window. "How so?" "Your board is asking questions." Richard's expression tightened slightly. "Already?" "Yes." He could almost picture the meeting. Investors watching stock movement. Advisors calculating risk. A simple story about a child could quickly become something the corporate world labeled unpredictable. "What are they worried about?" he asked. "Public perception," she said carefully. Richard nodded slowly. "That's what they always worry about." He ended the call. Behind him, Annie held up her drawing. "Look." Richard turned. The picture showed 3 people standing together, a tall figure, a smaller figure, and Annie in the middle holding both their hands. Danielle smiled weakly. "That's nice, baby." Annie pointed proudly. "That's Richard." Richard raised an eyebrow. "And who's that?" "That's you," Annie said, pointing at Danielle. Danielle laughed softly. "I look taller in your picture." "You are," Annie insisted. Richard smiled. But before he could respond, his phone rang again. This time, the caller ID made him pause. The chairman of his board. Richard stepped into the hallway to answer. "Good afternoon, David." The older man's voice came through immediately. "Richard, what exactly are you doing?" Richard leaned against the wall. "Helping someone. Helping someone has just wiped 2% off your company's stock value." Richard remained calm. "That seems like an overreaction. Investors don't like unpredictability." Richard glanced toward the living room where Annie was now explaining her drawing to Danielle. "Sometimes unpredictability is necessary." The chairman sighed. "Richard, listen to me. The internet has turned this into a social story. Race, class, privilege. Those topics move markets. I'm aware." "Then step back." Richard didn't answer. The chairman continued. Let the PR team issue a statement and close this down. Richard looked down the hallway again. Danielle coughed softly. Annie immediately reached for a glass of water and brought it to her. The movement was automatic, instinctive, protective. Richard felt something solid settle inside him. "No," he said quietly. Silence filled the line. Then the chairman spoke again. "Richard, think about what you're risking." Richard answered without hesitation. "I am, and I think a 6-year-old deserves better than being turned into a public misunderstanding." The chairman exhaled slowly. "You're turning a small incident into a national conversation." Richard nodded slightly. "Maybe it should be one." Another long pause. Finally, the chairman said something softer. "You've always been stubborn. So, I've been told. Just remember," the older man said, "you're not the only one affected by your decisions." Richard ended the call. When he returned to the living room, Danielle looked at him carefully. That didn't sound like a friendly conversation. Richard sat down in the chair across from her. "It was my board." Danielle's expression tightened. "Because of me?" "No," Richard said firmly. "Because of the story." Danielle lowered her eyes. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Richard leaned forward slightly. "I know." Annie looked up. "What story?" Danielle hesitated. Richard answered gently. "The story about a very brave girl who rode her bike to keep a promise." Annie smiled. "That's me." Richard nodded. "Yes, it is." But his phone buzzed again. Another alert. This time it wasn't from business. It was from a national news network. The headline read, "Billionaire defends sick single mother after viral restaurant incident." Below it, a second line appeared. "Civil rights leaders demand investigation into restaurant treatment of child." Richard exhaled slowly. The story had grown far beyond anything he expected. Danielle saw the headline over his shoulder. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Oh no." Richard shook his head. "Don't panic." Danielle looked overwhelmed. "This is exactly what I was afraid of." Annie frowned. "Why?" Danielle struggled to explain. "Sometimes when the whole world starts talking about you, it stops feeling like your life." Richard watched her carefully. She was right. Fame and scrutiny could crush people who never asked for attention. But something else was happening too. The story was forcing people to confront something uncomfortable. Richard looked back at Annie. "You know what happens when a story gets big?" he asked. Annie shook her head. "More people hear it." "And that's bad?" she asked. Richard thought about that. "No," he said slowly. "Not if the truth is strong enough." Outside the window, another car slowed near the curb. But this one wasn't media. A black sedan. And the man stepping out wore an expensive suit. Danielle noticed it too. "Do you know him?" Richard's expression changed slightly. "Yes," he said quietly. "That's one of my investors." Danielle's eyes widened. "Why is he here?" Richard watched the man walking toward the porch. Because sometimes when a story grows this big, power shows up. And the next conversation was going to change everything. The man in the expensive suit walked up the narrow path toward the porch like he belonged somewhere much larger than this street. Richard recognized him immediately. Thomas Avery, senior partner at one of the largest investment firms backing Bennett Capital. A man who normally operated in glass towers and private conferences, not modest neighborhoods with cracked sidewalks and bicycles on the lawn. Danielle looked between them. "You know him," she whispered. Richard nodded once. "Yes." Annie looked up from her drawing. "Is he important?" Richard gave a faint smile. "He thinks he is." The knock came softly against the door frame even though it was already open. "Richard," Avery said. His voice carried the smooth confidence of someone used to controlling conversations before they began. Richard stepped toward the doorway. "Thomas." Avery glanced briefly past him into the living room. His eyes landed on Danielle. Then Annie. For a moment, something flickered across his face, surprise, maybe curiosity. "May I come in?" Avery asked. Richard stepped aside. Avery entered slowly, careful not to step on Annie's crayons scattered across the floor. "This is quite the situation," Avery said. Danielle pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I didn't expect company." Avery nodded politely. "Nor did I." He turned to Richard. "But when a story involving one of my largest investments starts trending nationally, I prefer to see things for myself." Richard crossed his arms. "So you drove across the city to inspect the crisis?" Avery smiled slightly. "Let's call it curiosity." Annie stood up and walked closer, studying Avery openly the way children do when they haven't learned to hide their thoughts yet. "You're one of Richard's bosses?" she asked. Avery chuckled. Something like that. Annie nodded as if that explained everything. Richard gestured toward the chair across from the couch. Sit. Avery sat down smoothly. For a moment, the room held an odd balance. Two worlds facing each other across a small coffee table. Danielle broke the silence. I'm sorry if this situation is causing problems for your business. Avery waved a hand dismissively. Business always has problems. Then he looked directly at Richard. The real question is whether this one becomes an opportunity. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. I'm listening. Avery leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on his knees. The public loves stories like this. Danielle frowned. What kind of stories? Avery answered calmly. Redemption stories. Compassion stories. Powerful people helping ordinary families. Richard's expression hardened. Careful. Avery raised a hand. I'm not criticizing you, Richard. Then he gestured toward Annie. In fact, this little girl may have accidentally created the most powerful narrative opportunity your company has had in years. Danielle's face stiffened. I'm not interested in being anyone's narrative. Avery met her gaze politely. Of course not. But the way he said it made Richard uneasy. Annie looked confused. What's a narrative? Richard answered gently. It means a story people tell. Annie nodded. Oh, Avery continued. Right now the country sees a billionaire defending a sick single mother and her brave child. He leaned back slightly. That kind of story moves public opinion. Richard watched him carefully. And what exactly are you suggesting? Avery smiled. I'm suggesting we lean into it. Danielle sat upright. We? Avery nodded. Yes. He spoke smoothly, like he was presenting a proposal in a boardroom. Imagine this headline 6 months from now. He paused for effect. Tech billionaire launches national program supporting single mothers and children. Danielle blinked. Avery continued. You become the face of a foundation. Scholarships, community support programs, mentorship initiatives. Annie whispered to Danielle. That sounds nice. Danielle didn't answer. Her eyes were still on Avery. And what do we get in return? She asked quietly. Avery smiled again. Financial stability. He gestured lightly around the room. A new home. Medical care. Education for Annie. Annie's eyes widened. A bigger house? Richard's jaw tightened. Thomas. But Avery continued calmly. In exchange, you share your story. Danielle's voice turned colder. You mean, we become part of the brand? Avery shrugged. That's one way to look at it. Silence settled heavily in the room. Annie looked between the adults. I don't understand, she said. Richard looked at Avery. You drove here to turn their lives into a marketing campaign. Avery sighed slightly. You're being dramatic. Richard stepped forward. No. His voice sharpened. I'm being accurate. Avery held up both hands. Richard, listen carefully. He gestured toward Annie. This story already belongs to the public now. Millions of people are watching. He leaned forward again. So the real question is simple. Danielle's voice was quiet but steady. What question? Avery answered smoothly. Do you want to control the story? Or let strangers control it for you? The words hung in the room. Danielle looked down at Annie. Annie stared at the floor, twisting the ear of her stuffed rabbit nervously. Richard watched Avery carefully, because the offer sounded generous, but something about it felt deeply wrong. And the next thing Richard said would determine whether this story stayed human or became something else entirely. Thomas Avery finished speaking and leaned back in the chair as if the matter were already decided. In his world, proposals like this usually ended the conversation. Money solved things. Opportunity smoothed discomfort. People eventually said yes. The room, however, remained silent. Danielle looked down at Annie, who was still twisting the ear of her stuffed rabbit. The child's brow was furrowed, trying to understand a conversation that felt far bigger than her small living room. Richard broke the silence. Thomas, he said calmly, let's step outside. Avery raised an eyebrow. Why? Because the rest of this conversation doesn't belong in front of them. Avery glanced once more at Danielle and Annie, then stood. Very well. The two men stepped onto the porch. The afternoon sun had warmed the quiet street, but the air between them felt colder. Avery adjusted his jacket. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be. Richard crossed his arms. No, he said quietly. You are. Avery sighed. Richard, listen to yourself. You're emotionally involved. That's understandable, but the situation is already public. If we guide the narrative, everyone benefits. Richard studied him. You're talking about a little girl like she's a press release. Avery shook his head. That's not what I said. It's exactly what you said. Avery's patience thinned slightly. I said the story is powerful. Richard's voice sharpened. Her life isn't a story. Avery paused. Then he said something softer, almost persuasive. You've built your entire career on understanding leverage. Richard didn't respond. Avery continued. This moment is leverage. He gestured toward the house. Danielle and Annie could walk away from this with financial security most families never see. Richard looked past him toward the street. A bicycle leaned against the porch railing. Annie's bicycle. Small. Red. One pedal slightly bent from use. He thought about the way she had stood in the restaurant doorway. Mom is sick, so I came instead. Richard turned back to Avery. You know what you're missing? Avery frowned. What? Richard answered quietly. They didn't ask for any of this. Avery's expression hardened. No one asks for opportunity. Richard stepped closer. Opportunity isn't the same thing as exploitation. The word hung in the air. Avery's jaw tightened. You think I'm exploiting them? I think you're thinking like an investor instead of a human being. Avery looked irritated now. And you're thinking like a man who forgot how the world works. Richard held his gaze. No. He paused. I'm remembering. Avery folded his arms. And what exactly are you remembering? Richard's voice dropped slightly. That not everything valuable belongs on a balance sheet. The two men stood quietly for a moment. Finally, Avery shook his head. You're walking away from a massive strategic advantage. Richard gave a faint smile. Maybe. Avery looked toward the house again. Then what's your plan? Richard didn't answer immediately, because the truth was, he hadn't fully formed one yet. But he knew one thing with absolute clarity. They're not becoming a marketing campaign. Avery sighed. You're being idealistic. Richard shrugged. Sometimes that's necessary. Avery checked his watch. Investors won't see it that way. Richard nodded. I know. And if this damages the company? Richard met his eyes. Then we deal with it. Avery studied him for several seconds. You've changed. Richard gave a quiet laugh. Maybe I just had a clearer look at things last night. Avery turned toward the porch steps. Be careful, Richard. Richard raised an eyebrow. With what? Avery looked back. The world doesn't reward people for choosing the harder road. Richard glanced through the window. Inside, Annie had climbed onto the couch beside Danielle and was showing her another drawing. For a moment, Danielle laughed softly despite the fever. Richard turned back to Avery. Sometimes the reward isn't the point. Avery didn't reply. He walked down the porch steps and toward his car. Before he opened the door, he spoke once more. If you change your mind, call me. Richard didn't answer. The black sedan drove away quietly. Richard remained standing on the porch for a long moment. The neighborhood had settled again. The reporters were gone. The street looked ordinary, but inside the house, something fragile and honest was waiting. Richard opened the door and stepped back inside. Danielle looked up immediately. What happened? Richard walked into the living room. He made an offer. Danielle studied his face, and Richard shook his head. I turned it down. Danielle blinked. You didn't even tell me what it was. Richard smiled slightly. You didn't need to hear it. Annie looked curious. What kind of offer? Richard crouched slightly so he was eye level with her. The kind where people try to turn real lives into a big story. Annie frowned. That sounds weird. Richard nodded. It is. Danielle leaned back against the couch. You could have taken it. Richard shook his head again. No. Why not? Richard glanced around the small living room. The drawings on the refrigerator, the worn couch, the quiet courage in Danielle's tired eyes. Because, he said softly, some things shouldn't be bought. Danielle looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something simple. Thank you. Richard nodded once, but Annie was still thinking. She held up her drawing again. Richard? Yes. She pointed at the picture of the three figures holding hands. Is this still our story? Richard looked at the drawing, then at Danielle, then back at Annie. Yes, he said. For now, it is. But outside the quiet house, the story was still growing, and somewhere across the city, someone else had just decided to step into it. Richard had just sat down when the knock came again. This time it was softer, more cautious. Danielle looked toward the door with visible confusion. You're expecting someone else? She asked. Richard shook his head. No. Annie hopped off the couch immediately. I'll get it. Before either adult could stop her, she had already opened the door. A woman stood on the porch. She looked to be in her late 50s, wearing a long navy coat and holding a leather folder under one arm. Her silver hair was pulled back neatly, and her posture carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades walking into difficult rooms. Annie looked up at her. "Hi." The woman smiled gently. "Hello there." Danielle stood slowly, still weak but alert. "Can I help you?" The woman stepped inside the doorway and extended her hand. "My name is Eleanor Whitaker." Richard's eyebrows lifted slightly. He recognized the name immediately. Eleanor Whitaker, former federal judge, current director of the Whitaker Civil Justice Foundation, one of the most respected legal voices in the country. Danielle, however, looked confused. "I'm sorry. Have we met?" Eleanor shook her head. "No." Then she glanced briefly at Richard. "But I've been watching what's happening." Richard stood. "That was fast." Eleanor smiled slightly. "When something involving a child and public perception starts trending nationwide, my office tends to notice." Annie tilted her head. "Are you a lawyer?" Eleanor chuckled softly. "Yes." Annie nodded. "Okay." She walked back to the couch and picked up her crayons again. Apparently satisfied with the explanation, Eleanor turned back toward Danielle. "May I sit?" Danielle gestured toward the chair. "Of course." Eleanor sat down and placed the leather folder on the table. "I won't waste your time," she said calmly. Richard leaned against the wall, watching. Eleanor continued that, "Since early this morning, my foundation has received dozens of messages about your situation." Danielle looked uneasy. "What situation?" Eleanor answered gently. "The one where a 6-year-old girl tried to protect her mother and ended up in the center of a national conversation." Danielle looked down. "I never wanted that." Eleanor nodded. "Most people in these situations don't." Richard crossed his arms. "So why are you here?" Eleanor opened the folder. "Because public narratives can turn dangerous very quickly." Danielle's shoulders tightened. "I know." Eleanor slid a printed page across the table. "These are some of the online messages directed toward you." Danielle hesitated before looking. Her face paled. "They're saying I planned this," she whispered. Richard stepped forward. "Don't read those." But Eleanor spoke calmly. "Unfortunately, ignoring accusations doesn't make them disappear." Danielle closed the folder gently. "What do they want from me?" Eleanor answered plainly. "Some people want a villain." Annie looked up from the couch. "Why?" Eleanor smiled sadly. "Because stories feel easier when someone is the bad guy." Annie frowned. "But we didn't do anything bad." Eleanor nodded. "I know." She turned to Richard. "You handled the media well this morning." Richard shrugged slightly. "I told the truth. That's rarer than you might think." Danielle looked between them. "I don't understand what you're offering." Eleanor folded her hands. "Protection." Danielle blinked. "From what?" "From the storm that's forming." Richard studied her carefully. "What kind of protection?" Eleanor's voice remained steady. "My foundation specializes in cases where public narratives threaten ordinary people." Danielle looked overwhelmed again. "I'm not a case." "No," Eleanor said softly. "You're a mother." She gestured toward Annie. "And she's a child who deserves not to have her life rewritten by strangers." Annie nodded enthusiastically. "I agree." Richard almost smiled. Eleanor continued. "If the situation escalates, my team will ensure the facts remain clear." Richard raised an eyebrow. "You think it will escalate?" Eleanor met his gaze. "It already is." She slid another page across the table. A news headline. "National debate grows over viral restaurant incident." Below it were 2 opposing opinion pieces, one defending Annie, one accusing Danielle of manipulation. Danielle's voice trembled slightly. "I can't fight the entire internet." Eleanor shook her head. "You won't have to." She glanced at Richard. "Assuming Mr. Cole intends to keep standing where he's standing." Richard didn't hesitate. "I do." Eleanor nodded once. "Good." Then she looked at Danielle. "My offer is simple." Danielle waited. "My team will represent you publicly if necessary." Danielle swallowed. "How much does that cost?" Eleanor smiled gently. "Nothing." Danielle blinked. "Why?" Eleanor looked toward Annie. "Because sometimes justice begins with something small." She paused, like a little girl riding her bicycle to keep a promise. The room fell quiet again. Annie whispered to Danielle, "Mom, I like her." Danielle laughed weakly. "Me too." Richard studied Eleanor carefully. "You're not just here out of kindness." Eleanor smiled knowingly. "No." Richard waited. She leaned back slightly. "I'm here because stories like this reveal something about a country." Richard nodded slowly. "And what does this one reveal?" Eleanor answered quietly. That people are paying attention. Outside the window, another car slowed near the curb. Not reporters this time. Neighbors. People curious about the house everyone was talking about. The story had already moved beyond the internet. It had reached the real world. And Eleanor Whitaker knew something the others were only beginning to understand. This story was about to become much bigger than any of them expected. The afternoon had grown quiet again. For nearly an hour after Eleanor Whitaker arrived, the small living room felt strangely calm despite the storm building outside. Annie had returned to her drawings on the coffee table while Danielle rested against the couch. Still weak but more relaxed now that someone experienced seemed to understand the situation. Richard stood near the window watching the neighborhood. People drove by slower than usual. The internet had turned their small blue house into a place of curiosity. Eleanor closed the folder on the table and spoke gently. Things may stay quiet for a few hours. Danielle looked up. Or, Eleanor gave a faint smile, or the next wave will arrive. Almost as if summoned by the words, Richard's phone vibrated. He checked the screen. Unknown number, he answered. Richard Cole. A confident voice responded. Mr. Cole, this is Sandra Liu from National Morning Network. Richard glanced at Eleanor. I'm familiar with it. We're covering the story that's been trending all day. Richard remained calm. I assume someone would. Sandra continued. We'd like to invite the young girl involved to appear on tomorrow's live broadcast. The room went still. Richard didn't respond immediately. Sandra continued quickly. We believe hearing directly from Annie could help people understand what actually happened. Richard looked across the room. Annie sat cross-legged, coloring carefully inside the lines of a bright yellow star. She had no idea the entire country was now discussing her. Richard finally spoke. She's 6. Yes, Sandra said, which is why the public response has been so emotional. Richard's voice hardened slightly. She's not a spokesperson. Sandra adjusted her tone. We would make it very gentle. Just a short conversation. Millions of viewers. Eleanor raised an eyebrow from across the room. Richard walked toward the kitchen to continue the call privately. What exactly do you want from a 6-year-old? He asked. Sandra answered honestly. Her perspective? Richard almost laughed. You mean her innocence? Sandra paused. That's one way to put it. Richard looked through the kitchen doorway toward the living room again. Danielle watched him anxiously. Eleanor remained calm but attentive. Annie was now drawing a large house with 5 windows. Richard spoke quietly. No. Sandra sounded surprised. You're declining? Yes, Mr. Cole. With respect, this could shift public opinion dramatically. Richard replied calmly. A child shouldn't carry that responsibility. Sandra tried one more time. Would you at least discuss it with her mother? Richard hesitated. Send me the details. He ended the call. When he returned to the living room, Danielle immediately read his expression. What happened? Richard sat down slowly. A national network wants Annie on live television tomorrow. Annie's head popped up. Television? Danielle looked stunned. Live? Richard nodded. They think hearing Annie tell the story will calm the public debate. Annie's eyes lit up slightly. Like a cartoon channel. Eleanor smiled faintly. Not quite. Danielle looked overwhelmed again. I don't know how to handle this. Richard leaned forward. You don't have to decide immediately. Annie raised her hand as if she were in school. Can I say something? All 3 adults turned toward her. Of course, Danielle said softly. Annie thought for a moment. If I talk on TV, will people stop being mean to Mom? The question landed heavily in the room. Danielle's eyes filled instantly. Oh, sweetheart. Annie continued quietly. I don't like when people say she's bad. Richard felt a tightness in his chest. Eleanor studied Annie with deep respect. This child understood more than most adults. Danielle pulled Annie closer. You don't have to fix everything. Annie looked uncertain. But I started it. Richard spoke gently. You didn't start anything. Annie frowned. But I rode my bike. Richard nodded. Yes, and that was brave. He paused. But brave doesn't mean you have to carry the whole world. Annie thought about that carefully. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. There's another question to consider. Danielle looked at her. What question? Eleanor answered calmly. If Annie speaks publicly, her life changes. Danielle's expression darkened. How? Eleanor's voice remained steady. Attention. She gestured toward the window. Today it's curiosity. She paused. Tomorrow it could be national recognition. Danielle looked at Annie. My daughter deserves a normal childhood. Annie whispered, but I want people to know Mom is good. The room fell silent again. Richard finally spoke. Maybe there's another way. Eleanor turned toward him. What do you mean? Richard picked up Annie's drawing from the table. The picture showed 3 figures holding hands. Just like before. You told the truth once already, he said to Annie. Annie nodded. At the restaurant? Yes. Richard placed the drawing gently on the table. And sometimes the most powerful truth doesn't need a television studio. Annie tilted her head. What does it need? Richard smiled slightly. Time. Danielle squeezed Annie's hand. Eleanor leaned back thoughtfully, because she knew something the others were only beginning to realize. The choice they made tonight would decide how this story ended, and the entire country was waiting to see what Annie would do next. The house was quiet that evening. The sun had already begun sinking behind the rows of small homes across the street, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. Inside the living room, the lights were dim and warm, the kind of quiet that usually came after a long day. Danielle sat on the couch with a blanket around her shoulders. Her fever had begun to fade, but exhaustion still lingered in her face. Annie sat beside her, leaning against her arm. Richard stood near the window, watching the fading light. Eleanor Whitaker sat in the chair across from them, calm and thoughtful. No one spoke for several minutes. The decision about the television interview still hovered in the air. Finally, Annie broke the silence. I've been thinking, she said softly. Danielle brushed Annie's hair gently. What about, sweetheart? Annie looked down at the drawing still sitting on the table. The same picture she had made earlier. 3 people holding hands. I don't want to go on TV. Danielle blinked. You don't? Annie shook her head slowly. No. Richard didn't interrupt. Eleanor simply watched. Annie continued. TV people ask lots of questions. Danielle nodded. They do. And sometimes they make things sound different, Annie said. Richard exchanged a quiet glance with Eleanor. The child understood more than most adults. Annie pointed to her drawing. I already told the truth. Danielle followed her finger. Yes, you did. Annie looked up at Richard. Do we have to keep telling it again and again? Richard smiled gently. No. Annie thought for a moment. Then she said something simple. I think people will figure it out. The room went quiet again. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. That may be the wisest decision anyone has made today. Danielle hugged Annie closer. You're sure? Annie nodded. I just want things to go back to normal. Richard looked around the small living room again. The worn couch, the drawings taped to the refrigerator, the red bicycle leaning near the porch outside. Normal. It suddenly seemed like the most valuable thing in the world. Eleanor stood slowly. Then that's the decision. Danielle looked relieved. No TV? No TV, Eleanor confirmed. Richard added softly. We let the story breathe. Annie tilted her head. What does that mean? Richard answered simply. It means we let the truth speak for itself. Outside the window, the streetlights flickered on. The day that had begun with confusion, reporters, and strangers had finally started to settle. Eleanor gathered her folder. I'll have my team monitor things online, she said. But I suspect something interesting will happen now. Danielle looked curious. What? Eleanor smiled slightly. When people see a child refuse attention, they tend to respect it. Richard walked Eleanor to the door. Before she stepped outside, she paused. You handled this well today, she said. Richard shrugged slightly. I just tried to keep things honest. Eleanor nodded. That's rarer than you think. She stepped into the evening and walked down the quiet sidewalk. Inside the house, Annie yawned. Danielle laughed softly. I think someone needs sleep. Annie nodded sleepily. But first, she ran to the table and picked up her drawing. Then she handed it to Richard. For you. Richard took the paper carefully. Why me? Annie smiled. Because you helped. Richard looked down at the drawing again. 3 people holding hands. Simple. Honest. Real. Thank you, he said quietly. Later that night, after Annie had fallen asleep upstairs, Richard sat on the porch swing outside the house. Danielle joined him with 2 cups of tea. For a moment, they simply watched the quiet street. The same street where Annie had ridden her bicycle the night before. It's strange, Danielle said softly. What is? This whole thing started with one small decision. Richard nodded. A little girl keeping a promise. Danielle smiled faintly. I was worried the world would crush her spirit. Richard shook his head. Sometimes the world needs a reminder instead. Danielle looked toward the window where Annie slept. You think people will forget about the story? Richard considered that. Maybe. He paused. But the important people won't. Danielle raised an eyebrow. Who? Richard smiled gently. The ones who needed to hear it. A soft breeze moved through the trees. Inside the house, the refrigerator hummed quietly. Upstairs, Annie slept peacefully. And somewhere across the country, people who had watched the story unfold were beginning to realize something simple. The most powerful moment of the entire story had not been in a restaurant, not on a porch with reporters, and not on television. It had been when a 6-year-old girl stood in front of a stranger and said the words that started everything. Mom is sick, so I came instead. And sometimes the smallest acts of courage create the biggest changes in the human heart. This story reminds us that true kindness often appears in the simplest moments. A 6-year-old girl rode her bicycle to keep a promise for her mother, not because she wanted attention, but because she believed honesty and love mattered. Her small act of courage revealed something powerful. Compassion can break down suspicion, and integrity can shine even in a complicated world. The lesson for all of us is simple. When we choose empathy over judgment and stand up for the people we love, even the smallest voice can remind the world what real humanity looks like. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.